Hello, Manchester, and welcome back to Ward 13. And my special guest today is, just as last week, is Maureen Mann, formerly a state representative, and you're running again.
In a special election in Rockingham 32.
Right. And if you want to see the previous show, if you haven't seen this show, it'll be on YouTube. Maureen, in our last episode, we briefly talked about downshifting. First of all, I want to tell the guests we're going to have Thomas Massengale is going to be back. Tom, are you there?
I am, John.
You're going to have to wait a few minutes. Tom is going to, as we have been talking about 3 of the last 4 weeks, talking about GMOs because Ms. Mann, or I should call you the Honorable Maureen Mann, is a
prime sponsor.
Tom, of the GMO labeling bill here in New Hampshire, and she can talk about that. But first, we're going to talk about this Republican budget, this radical Republican budget that is just going to cut social services and infrastructure and the funding. They're attacking once again the university. And I'd just like to say the Nashua Mayor, Donnelly Loiseau, who's a Republican, has expressed she's very concerned with how these budget cuts are going to affect the city of Nashua because the costs are going to be downshifted to the city. And I don't have the exact formula, but for every certain amount of budget cuts up in Concord, the Nashua property tax rate will go up 1%. Why is that, Maureen?
I don't actually understand the finances in Nashua because, of course, I represent 4 small towns in Rockingham County.
But you're going to be affected, too.
Everybody is going to be affected. There are sort of 3 broad categories of cuts. The cuts to the DOT, which originally were $88 million, and now $50 million of that has been replaced by cuts to education.
Right.
So both of those are going to have the effect of downshifting. The decision that was made is they will continue 93, but the 6 betterment districts in the state, which are, so the smaller state roads, for instance, are taken care of by the 6 betterment districts, and towns and cities. 12% of that money was going back to cities and towns to work on local roads. More of it was going back to betterment districts. That $38 million is gone now. So you have potholes, you'll keep potholes.
Unless the city or town pays for them.
Precisely. And one of the things that the DOT is doing in some small bridges, and for instance, if a town wants to take, the DOT will close them, or the town has the option to take them over. So that's one source of funds. But because of the $50 million that was taken out of education in order to restore some of the cuts to DOT, that's a major downshift to the towns. Property taxes are the biggest burden. The biggest burden of everyone's property taxes is the cost of the schools.
Right. Now, Nashua is going to follow through with cuts to the school budget. It's right here. Nashua mayor's concerned, and they're going to make up at the shortfall that's going to come from the state, which they're anticipating, where Manchester's mayor, I don't think he's anticipating anything but, being reelected on whatever he can. They're going to cut the schools in Nashua because of this.
But you can't just sort of, I mean, in one sense you can say, all right, I'm going to cut 1%. But where do you find that 1%? Contracts with suppliers have already been signed.
Right.
Providers of special education services or out-of-school town placements have been done. You have teachers' contracts. Those will all have to be renegotiated. And it's not that simple to just say, I'm going to cut X amount from the budget.
Right.
You have to figure out where you can cut it and if you can cut it. And then the third thing, of course, are the DHHS cuts.
Well, can I ask you one thing about those? It seems like the recklessness up in Concord, spearheaded by what I call the anarcho-libertarian wing of the party, the Liberty Alliance part of the people. They're reckless. Are they actually endangering like federal matching funds with these cuts?
There is something like $73 million just in matching funds that will be lost to DHHS.
The Department of Health and Human Services.
Health and Human Services. Never mind the money that will be lost for transportation, because much of the transportation projects are 80-20 cuts, 80% from the federal government, 20. But DHHS, what people don't understand is, by law, by RSA 165, dating back to 1966, by law, towns are responsible for all kinds of things to take care of people that
under
now the state by law has said they would do and are just abandoning it. Meals on Wheels, emergency shelters, homeless shelters.
That's fascinating you said it, because Tom's in England now, and does this sound familiar with the Tory government, Tom? Budget cuts? And
of course, 100 very prestigious doctors just came out with a paper 2 days ago.
Oh, Tom, we're still talking about the budget cuts. We'll get to...
the NHS will be slowly dismantled.
Oh, the National Health Service is going to be dismantled if the Tories, the Conservatives, if Cameron wins the election?
Well, I don't think David Cameron's spinning it that way, but there is a group of doctors who are very much suggesting that's the case.
Okay, and we're... the thing is...
we have to remember, it is campaign season here, so...
Right. Yeah, I saw that the Prime Minister got assaulted by a giant chicken. But we'll get back to you in a second. The interesting why I went to Tom about England was, is New Hampshire settled by people from East Anglia. So my brother's also an expatriate, lives in England, and still a U.S. citizen. And when his in-laws come to here, they're perfectly at home. Names are all the same, and they call them roundabouts there, the rotaries. So they're like at heaven in New England. But the thing was that we actually have the poor law dating back from when this was English North America. And I'll never forget in 2011 when the anarcho-libertarians went after the poor law, tried to strike it down, because it's the poor law that the towns have a responsibility to the poor, the disabled, the people that need help. That is part of the founding fathers of New Hampshire credo, is it not?
It is, and it is going to have a major impact with these cuts on cities and towns. Just look at $6 million in cuts to nursing homes.
My God.
Are we going to close county nursing homes? And we can't. I mean, we cannot do that, which means that money is going to have to be picked up by local property taxes. I don't think people really paid that much attention to their county taxes, but they're going to have to start paying attention, because with cuts to school funding, cuts to DOT funding, cuts to county funding, that's going to have a major effect on the property taxes of every person in this state. So it's easy to say, cut taxes, cut funding. But this is going to hit every single one of us.
When I was running for office, I pointed out quite rightly, I believe, that after the first Tea Party government, when they won that incredible majority from the 2010 to the end of 2011, they slashed the university funding by 50%. They slashed infrastructure. And is it a coincidence that suddenly population growth to New Hampshire suddenly flatlined? Is it a coincidence that suddenly businesses were no longer relocating here, and some businesses went back to Massachusetts? You need infrastructure and education, particularly higher education, to create like incubators to attract new businesses. We live, Manchester is 55 miles away from Boston, which The Economist, the conservative English news magazine, said 7th most dynamic economy in the world. And you wonder, why aren't we like Seattle is to the Silicon Valley? These budget cuts, the school system that's so radically decayed under the Manchester tax cap, and it's quite incredible. I when I campaigned, I said we can't afford another round of these cuts because it will be economically disastrous to the state. Would you agree?
I do agree. And the other thing I'd like to point out is in 2010, with that veto-proof majority in both the House and the Senate,
right,
even though we had a Democratic governor, and all the talk about cut taxes, the only tax that was cut was the increase in the cigarette tax was rolled back.
Right.
That was their opportunity with a veto-proof majority. If they really wanted to cut taxes and change the state, they would have done it. But they know, in fact, businesses don't want tax cuts any more than average citizens do. Because we know we barely fund this state now. We have no sales tax. We have no income tax. So what we do is we nickel and dime people with fees.
Right.
And you start cutting those fees. Like, for instance, the cut now in the rooms and meals tax in this recent budget. That money, a lot of it, goes back to the cities and towns.
Right.
So if we reduce the meals and rooms tax, that money is not going back to cities and towns. And businesses understand that. Restaurants understand that we need a vibrant economy here to attract tourists. If our roads are filled with potholes, people aren't coming here skiing. If we have constant construction, people aren't coming here to go to Lake Winnipesaukee
right,
or wherever in the summer. And reasonable people understand that. It's the philosophical thing about cut taxes, cut spending, without regard to the consequences that seems to be taking over in our society.
You know, their whole philosophy of this cut taxes, cut services, if that works, why is Boston booming? Why is California the greatest generator of jobs? And we're talking about real jobs, the new millennium jobs of high tech and then biotech. Now, I'd like to get into the GMO labeling thing right now so we can engage Tom, and then we'll get back. Hopefully, we'll wrap the show up. Tom. This is when Maureen Mann, she was a state rep, and she introduced the GMO labeling bill.
The one that New Hampshire buried.
Right. Did Vermont
Didn't
pass it?
bury it. It
Okay.
wasn't that bad. But,
Okay, Maureen, I'm going to let Tom take over a bit because
Great.
he really knows the subject.
I'm sure Maureen knows. The good news in that regard is that New Hampshire tax money at least won't be wasted, even if New Hampshire gets screwed on the labeling bill, given the bipartisan bill in the House of Representatives right now,
Right.
trying to block states from labeling GMO at all.
There is a bill, the Republicans, we were talking about this last week, the states' rights. They're all into states' rights. They've just introduced a bill that federal regulation would obviate, which would negate the states cannot do GMO labeling.
Cannot require it.
Right. So much for states' rights.
And it's a bit worse than that because it's actually a bipartisan bill.
Right. Oh, it is a we know about Hillary and her support for GMO. But can you tell us what happened in New Hampshire with the GMO labeling bill?
Very briefly,
Right.
Connecticut has already passed a labeling bill. Maine has already passed a labeling bill. Vermont has passed a labeling bill. The Connecticut and the Maine bill each require 4 other Northeast states to pass similar legislation for their bills to go into effect. And that's because people are not going to relabel just for one state,
Right.
but they are going to relabel for
A region.
a region. Vermont's bill does not have what's called the trigger, it's called. The New Hampshire bill last year was by a study committee, overwhelmingly voted in favor of labeling.
Now, let's just point out that the legislature last year, Tom, the New Hampshire State Legislature, was in the hands of the Democrats. Was the Senate? Was the Senate? No, the Senate was still
the Senate was
Republican.
not.
So you had to go through Jeb Bradley, who is
Well, no, in the House.
Okay, the House is
the
Democrats.
subcommittee, we had 19 meetings and studied this over 3 months,
Right.
with all kinds of experts, recommended ought to pass, recommended labeling.
It should pass.
But it went to the full committee, and the full committee was divided, and there were like 2 more votes against passage. So when it went to the full House floor, you had to overturn an expedient to legislate. We lost by 23 votes. So if 12 people had changed their vote, we would have overturned that inexpedient to legislate.
That would have been the House.
So it never got to that was
So
House.
it had to have gone to the Senate.
So it
then.
never got to the Senate.
Right.
It will be introduced again this second year of the biennium coming up, probably from the Senate.
Okay, now what were the pressures? Was Monsanto lobbyists up there lobbying?
There was an enormous, just as in California, Washington State, everywhere else, millions of dollars were spent by Monsanto,
Millions.
Syngenta, Bayer, the grocers. There were lobbyist money for those groups donated to people in the New Hampshire House and Senate. The 2 biggest criticisms were it should be done by the federal government. And my response to that is lots of things should have been.
Exactly.
Like women's rights to vote,
Yes.
18-year-old voting. What happens is the states, by passing legislation, push the central government. The other big concern was we'll probably get sued by Monsanto. That's why
Really?
the Vermont case is so important, because the Grocers Association, Monsanto, Syngenta, that whole group, have brought suit against Vermont because their labeling bill didn't require a trigger. And it's still in court. And this case is very important because if Vermont wins their case, then labeling is going to happen.
So essentially, Tom's father worked for one of the great law firms in America, Paul of Weiss Rifkin. So I'm sure, Tom, who does Monsanto have for a law firm in the United States?
Well, as you know, they used to have Hillary Clinton.
What do they have, Robert Bennett or Bob Bennett? But what you have is, go ahead.
As your guest pointed out, who we have to watch out for. I mean, there really should be a law about truth in labeling, and it is the Grocery Manufacturers Association,
Right.
which is anything but what it sounds like, that is channeling enormous money at the national and the local level to prevent this from happening. Well, if you look at your papers, spreading just tons of disinformation about genetically modified food, about people's opinions toward genetically modified food. One of the latest things they're circulating is the idea that it would cost, in the debate going on in New York, is that it would cost every family $500 per year more in groceries to have GMO labeling.
But
which is just absurd. But people read these things, accept these things.
Right.
Reporters, they love having an article pre-written for them as a press release.
Of course.
And this stuff is showing up in the newspapers, showing up in the major media, and it's very difficult to fight a well-lubricated machine with so much money.
Well, they also have, you were telling me, they have agricultural libel laws, too. We don't have that in New Hampshire, do we? In Texas, this was years ago, Oprah Winfrey got
I remember the
caught
case.
up in that. Where a Pulitzer Prize winner wrote about the beef industry. Richard Rhodes won the Pulitzer Prize. And his book that the conditions for mad cow disease were right here in the United States. Now, that book got no reviews at all from a Pulitzer Prize winner who had 2 bestsellers because, once again, the food industry advertises. And, and Oprah took it up, and she wound up spending millions of dollars, was sued in Texas, and I don't even know if she won on a First Amendment, but they have something called, agricultural libel. It's scary. the power of these corporations, particularly as Tom and I last week told us that, you know, the Lancet, the British medical journal, most prestigious in the world, other than the New England Journal of Medicine, that Roundup, which is in all 80% of all processed foods, is a carcinogen, and it's not something you can wash off, is it, Tom? It's in the plant.
And you know, it's in the reproductive organs of the plant, which are in fact the seeds, which is what you eat.
God.
The corn kernels, the wheat, and that the research came actually, because they published it. It came from the WHO,
The World Health Organization.
right?
Right. So
But curiously, at the same time, here in Europe, what's just happened is GMOs have found their way back in because of the EU, which had very extensive bans against genetically modified organisms as crops and as imports. Suddenly they've broken all that down and left it up to the states to decide
the individual
what they grow
countries
within their borders and what they import.
Monsanto has that type of political muscle in Europe.
Well, sure. Don't you remember the releases that Assange put up on WikiLeaks?
No. We'll have to discuss that another time.
The Department of State, through the wires to and from the U.S. ambassador in Paris, was threatening Europe to take on GMO foods.
Okay, I didn't know that.
The Department of State was behind this.
Which was Hillary Clinton.
People don't really understand these issues, so it didn't stick to the wall. It disappeared.
Right.
But yes, it was one of the big WikiLeaks releases, and people should look it up. People should Google it.
Okay, Tom.
It's horrifying to see it behaving like this.
Yeah. Tom, we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to say goodbye to you. We'll have you on in 2 weeks. A week after this show, but we'll have you back on soon. Okay.
Go ahead. It was a pleasure, John.
Okay. Take care. We only have a few minutes left. You have a camera there. Is there something you'd like to say to the people of New Hampshire, the people of your district?
Well, if you want to stick to the topic of GMO labeling.
Oh, no, anything you'd like to talk about. What is the critical thing in the election you're facing?
I think the critical thing in this election is who gets to vote on the budget. The election will take place on May 19th, and it'll be one more vote for cuts to the DOT, cuts to counties, cuts to towns if my opponent wins. It will be one more vote for no regulations of guns. It will be one more vote for eliminating Common Core, and there are problems with Common Core or with smarter balance. But to have a philosophy that all education should be totally local is a disaster in terms of preparing our kids for the future and a disaster in terms of what it would do to property taxes. If, on the other hand, you want someone who has experience in our community, 10 years ago I started a newspaper that covers the 4 towns that I had previously represented and I know those towns. I have been involved in activities in all those towns. I believe that we as human beings have some responsibility to care for the weakest among us, those who need the most help. Certainly there can be efficiencies in government, but there's a huge difference between efficiency and nastiness to poor people. And that's where we are.
Yeah. I'd also like to point out, as Tim Smith told me, constituent services. Now, Tim is very much helping people navigate the system and everything. And I have to tell you, if you are an anarcho-libertarian Republican and you don't believe in the services, let's be honest, constituent services is not going to be high on your list, is it?
That's one of the things I am most proud of. In the terms I served, I sponsored legislation at the request of people in all 4 of the communities I represent. I sponsored legislation at the request of the select boards in the communities I represent. Often to get that passed, I worked with a Republican state senator, and the biggest thing I did was get a stoplight at a dangerous intersection, which kids had to go through to get to school.
John, can you show the slide of Maureen where you can go? You have a Facebook page, and what's it called?
Maureen Mann, New Hampshire State Representative.
Oh, okay. And we also have maureenmann.blogspot.com where they can go, and you have posts and
It's pretty clear where I stand.
Okay. And thank you very much for visiting. And thank you very much, Manchester and the rest of New Hampshire. The Rockingham County, welcome to Ward 13. Till next week, thank you.